I've lost track of, whether my microphone was on or off. I'm very grateful that when we have times of trouble, we have people that raise us up, right, Herb? I'm glad that you're okay. This pericope, this story that you just heard, appears in all 4 of the Gospels. But there are some significant differences between how this story appears in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and how it appears in John. I mean, there are significant differences between the 4 Gospels just in and of themselves. And to illustrate this, I want to share a couple of memes that I've shared with my Introduction to New Testament class that I teach at the college. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels because they include many of the same illustrations, much of the same content. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Synoptic Gospels, have quite a bit of overlap in their accounts, in some stories verbatim, exactly the same, although they have different theological purposes, writing for different audiences. Like when we write a synopsis of something, we pull together information and summarize it, bring it together clearly, highlighting the main points. The Synoptic Gospels tend to agree on some of the most significant points and presentation of Jesus' story, even though the emphasis in each of the 3 varies. John, however, does things a little differently. John's presentation of Jesus' life has a very different flavor, maybe a little bling, we might say. It has been referred to as the spiritual gospel by Eusebius in the 4th century. I've heard it described as mystical. Both of these descriptions lend themselves to an understanding that John, then, is less historical in his presentation. Interestingly, particularly given some of the imagery, which includes multiple references to water and blood from the beginning to the end of the gospel, it often seems to me like John is perhaps the most embodied gospel, suggesting from the very beginning how the spirit and the body are intertwined. This entire message, the entire activity of God, is summed up pretty well in the 1st chapter of John, I think, verses 1 through 4 and then 14. From the very beginning of John, we see this implication of the embodiment of God, the incarnation of God, God's love, God's message, God's presence in human form. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word was with God in the beginning. Everything that came into being came through the Word, and without the Word, nothing came into being. What came into being through the Word was life, and the life was the light for all people. The Word became flesh and made his home among us. We have seen his glory, glory like that of a father's only son, full of grace and truth. So this story of Jesus flipping temples and clearing out the vendors in the temple is presented in all 4 Gospels, but there are important differences. One is the placement of this story in the sequence of the accounts of Jesus' life and ministry. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this story appears much later in the narrative, towards the end, in fact, of Jesus' ministry, and ultimately towards the end of Jesus' life. But here in the Gospel of John, it appears very early, in chapter 2. It comes right after the first sign, the first miracle that Jesus shows, changing water to wine at the wedding in Cana, which is one of my favorite scripture texts. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But this choice by the author in the Gospel of John to use this story here, earlier in Jesus' ministry, seems out of line with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. From our modern perspective, we tend to value historical accuracy and evidentiary proof, so we might try to figure out which one is historically correct. We might wonder where this event really fell in the timeline of Jesus' life. Did this episode in the story actually happen earlier or later? The reality is the earliest hearers of these gospel accounts probably didn't care a whole lot. Ancient hearers and readers did not expect biographies, stories of lives, to be chronologically accurate in the same way that we do today. The more important difference, then, between John's version and the Synoptic Gospels version is the purpose for sharing this story. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus' actions in the temple serve as one of the prompts for the religious authorities to want to kill Jesus. The focus is primarily on Jesus clearing the temple of the vendors with accusations of ill intent through the reference to the den of robbers that we see in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And then the leaders question his authority, which leads them to begin to look for a way to kill him. In John, though, because of this early position in the narrative, the story sets the stage for the entirety of Jesus' ministry. And there's some tension created right from the very beginning between what the religious leaders and institutions are doing and what God is doing through Jesus. His authority is still questioned, but it seems to be more in terms of who is this guy and what's he all about? And with Jesus' response, the groundwork is laid, in case the first few verses of the gospel didn't do it, that Jesus is the human incarnation of God, the embodiment of God on earth. None of the three synoptic accounts include the piece that John includes about the temple being Jesus' body. But it could not be more clear in John. No suggestive allusion with unclear metaphor. Verse 21, but he was speaking of the temple of his body. And if Jesus is speaking of the temple as his body, knowing that we now live in a world where we are the hands and feet and breath and activity of Jesus as church congregation, as individual followers of this way, what does that say about the location of the temple now? I notice that Jesus doesn't come into the temple to bring more ritual, more laws, more requirements. He comes initially as a faithful person himself, traveling to the temple in Jerusalem for the approaching Passover, as Jews did. But ultimately, he is concerned, angered by what he saw. And ultimately, he comes to clean out some stuff. And it wasn't necessarily bad stuff. Here in John, what Jesus is removing is the animals and birds cluttering up the area and the vendors who are sitting there, as they probably have been doing for years, selling the things that faithful persons need to complete the ritual expectations of their faith. They likely saw themselves doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing and being very helpful and providing for the needs of faithful people. Tempting as it is to preach a sermon that focuses solely on how we as a church and we as individuals are the distributed temple of Jesus now in the world, and that is a big part of what I'm saying, to be sure, the reality is that we need to be careful to only identify ourselves with Jesus in this story. I don't think the text is suggesting that we should solely see ourselves as the ones who are to make our own whip and go out and remove injustices from the temple, although surely a part of what we are called to do is to lean into our prophetic nature, identify justice, call it out, help lead another way. Particularly in this time when the disparity between the rich and the poor is only increasing, racial and religious and gender-based acts of discrimination continue to occur. Violence is rampant in parts of the world, many parts of the world, both visible and underground. We are called to be a people of hope, a people of light, a people of justice. So yes, we identify our church and our very selves as the body of Jesus in the world, the embodied temple of God's love and peace. And also, In what ways must we open ourselves to the things that Jesus wants to clean out of the temple? What would Jesus overturn here and now? What might Jesus overturn in this congregation, this church building, this sanctuary? What stuff might Jesus overturn in the institutions of which we are a part, corporately and individually? What business are we doing, am I doing, that is not worthy of being raised up, not reflective of the holy, sacred temple that we might otherwise inhabit? What might Jesus overturn in your home, in your life, in your body? Those are hard questions. And I think the answers are very unique to each of us. I'm going to invite you to join me briefly as we think about those questions in a very simple breath prayer practice that I often use. And my hope is that it might help you to embody this attempt to turn over some tables. So I invite you to close your eyes, or if you prefer to keep your eyes open, you might gaze at the screen and see a visual that we often use during prayer time. Know that you and we sit here in the presence of one another, loved and cared for by each other and by God. And I'm going to invite you to put your hand on your chest and take a deep, slow breath in. Feel your chest filling with air, expanding to nourish your entire body with oxygen. Now let the air out and feel your chest lowering as the air leaves your body, having served its purpose. Breathe in again and out. And as you continue to breathe in and out, I invite you to find a word that you would like to think in your mind as you breathe in, a word to describe what you want to invite into your body. It might be the word Jesus, or God, or Spirit, or sacred, or light, or love, or peace. What do you want to invite in? Or maybe you don't have a word, and you just have an image in your mind, or a feeling. Breathe in and think that word, or see that image, or sense that feeling. And as you breathe out, I invite you to find a word that describes something you would like to clear out, a table you would like to flip over. It could be worry, or anger, or impatience, or greed, or envy, or an illness, or pain, or brokenness of any kind, stress or anxiety, general or specific. Or maybe you don't have a word, and you just have an image or a feeling. Breathe out and think that word, or see that image, or sense that feeling. Breathe in and think what you want to bring in. Breathe out and think what you would like to exit. Breathe in and breathe out. Breathe in and breathe out. Lent is a time for self-reflection and review. We are keenly aware that we need to shed things which prevent us from fully realizing the transformation of death into life that we know waits for us at the end of the story. Because not only are we looking back, but we are also looking ahead. Jesus is doing that in this scene in the temple as well, cleaning out some stuff that has been building up and gathering over time, practices and characteristics that have seeped in, normalized, unseen, unnoticed. And at the same time, he is pointing towards the future. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days, I will raise it up. The destruction part is hard, but we look forward with hope because we've been here before. We know that Easter is coming. We've crested the tippy top of March, and we can see the resurrection on our calendars on March 31st. But we have a ways to go yet in Lent. There is more to the story before we get to that point. Hard stuff waits for us, but the best is yet to come. Which takes me back to the story that precedes this one in the 2nd chapter of John. Jesus and his disciples and his mother are attending a wedding. The wine at the wedding runs out. And the mother of Jesus prompts him to respond. Some interesting dialogue takes place, but ultimately Jesus turns 6 large jars of water into wine. And not just any wine, the good wine. So good, in fact, that the head waiter, the one running the show, says to the groom, "Hey, this is so unusual. Normally, people serve the good stuff first. Everyone gets drunk, and then the cheap stuff comes out when people really start going to town. But you did things differently. You saved the best wine until now." Cleansing our hearts, our minds, our bodies of that which is not the best allows us to embody the temple fully in ways that provide the best for all around us. Cleansing out the not so great from our congregational temple too, practices, behaviors, messaging, this kind of rearranging is necessary for this temple to truly embody and reflect the best of Jesus to the world. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. May it be so.